When George Bush assumed presidency in 2001, he did not do so with a foreign policy agenda, and certainly not an Iraq agenda.
That all changed, of course, with 9/11, where, for better or for worse, President Bush was going to be a wartime president, at least through his first term and probably beyond.
Part of what shaped Bush's view was a sense that 9/11 was likely the first of many attacks on the United States of America, and that those attacks could involve weapons of mass destruction. That calculus is what led the Bush administration from its promised humble foreign policy to the invasion of Iraq.
WMD is really important to Saddam. It's work that saved his regime in the past.
And the intelligence community at the time said that this would be the first of a series of mass casualty attacks on the United States, some of which could involve weapons of mass destruction. And one of the things the president gets criticized for is the so-called axis of evil speech, where he talked about Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, and he said,
"States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world."
These three countries share a common characteristic, which they are both pursuing weapons of mass destruction, which is what we thought Saddam Hussein was at the time, and they are supporting terrorism. And therefore, could they be a link where weapons of mass destruction would get in the hands of terrorists? Having been through 9/11 and seeing what 19 terrorists could do with box cutters, you can only imagine what they might do with weapons of mass destruction.
It was that toxic mix, a ruthless dictator with a history of using WMD, and the terrorists' appetite for more attacks on the homeland that animated President Bush.
I think it's impossible to really understand the Iraq War without grasping who Saddam Hussein was, what he had done, and the image he cast across Iraq, across the Middle East region, and really across the globe. There were really noteworthy, significant achievements inside Iraq that he was responsible for accomplishing in the 1970s. But at the same time, I emphasize the brutality and cruelty of the regime. I emphasize the degree to which he immediately, starting in the middle 1970s, used the enormously increasing revenues of the Iraqi government to build up both conventional military capabilities and also to develop weapons of mass destruction, chemical and biological weapons. He initiated a very significant nuclear program, and he was truly infatuated with the prospect of utilizing weapons of mass destruction to cast his image across the Middle East region.
Armchair historians tend to view the Iraq War as a war of choice, as opposed to a war of necessity, like Afghanistan. But that's far from how it was seen in the White House at the time.
Iraq was really a war not of necessity, not of choice. It was war, what I would say, was last resort. Think about how long we'd been dealing with the problem of Iraq. Ever since the Gulf War, there were 16 UN Security Council resolutions called on Saddam Hussein to stop pursuing weapons of mass destruction or disclose that he had, stop supporting terror, stop invading his neighbors, which he had done with both Iran and Kuwait, and stop terrorizing his people. And they failed. Coercive diplomacy is largely over, and the president is faced with this choice. On the one hand, the president could say to Saddam Hussein, okay, you win. You've got to get out of jail free card. I'm not going to go into Iraq unless I get an 18th UN Security Council resolution, knowing that Putin and Chirac would block it. And if Bush had basically said, okay, Saddam, you're out, sanctions would have been lifted. Saddam, I think, would have been back into his old games of supporting terror, terrorizing people, and invading his neighbors, including potentially a rerun of the Kuwait invasion. And this time he wouldn't stop in Kuwait, he would go into Saudi Arabia. And finally, in terms of weapons of mass destruction, I think it's pretty clear he would have gotten into the nuclear business.
Between 1997 and 2001, he was making a systematic attempt and a successful attempt to undermine the sanctions regime. His government was generating during these years very significantly increased revenues, and as the Delphi report demonstrated, he was already using those revenues to resume his buildup of conventional capabilities, and he was saying to some of his scientists and military leaders that he would also restart his weapons of mass destruction programs once the sanction regime was totally eliminated.
Some have suggested that the Bush administration believes Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11. So how, a mere year and months after 9/11, were U.S. troops massed to enter Iraq?
Contrary to popular belief, we did not believe Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11. You couldn't tie it in that direction. So how would you explain going into Iraq?
But I don't think the administration went into Iraq to preserve world order. I think that the administration went into Iraq for reasons of national security. The overriding consideration for President Bush was his belief, perhaps an erroneous belief, but his belief, his sincere belief, that weapons of mass destruction existed in Iraq, and that those chemical and biological weapons might find their way into the hands of terrorists.
Iraq could decide on any given day to provide a biological or chemical weapon to a terrorist group or individual terrorists. Alliance with terrorists could allow the Iraqi regime to attack America without leaving any fingerprints.
Or that in the long run, or the intermediate term and the long term, Saddam would restart his weapons programs and, quote, blackmail the United States. Those were the reasons, not world order.
No matter the reasons, the question of fighting the war is one of tactics and strategy, and the White House deferred to the Pentagon. But it turned out that what the Pentagon thought was needed to fight the war and what would be needed after the war set the stage for later problems.
There was actually huge discord that was quite significant. Secretary Rumsfeld was insistent on using a very small force.
U.S. and coalition military leadership is trying to seek the proper balance between having a military footprint so large enough to help the Iraqi people win their fight against the terrorists, but not a footprint so large and so intrusive as to antagonize a proud and patriotic people, or to discourage the Iraqi people from taking initiative to run their own country themselves. We anticipate future coalition-level, force-level discussions at some point in 2006, after the new Iraqi government is in place and is prepared to discuss their future.
He was intent on getting out of Iraq as quickly as possible after the invasion and the toppling of the regime. So he assigned many fewer forces that various generals thought were appropriate, and then he engaged in rotation of forces in April and May of 2003 that were dysfunctional in terms of the Americans' ability to preserve order and stability inside Iraq. And why did Iraqis become disaffected? Part of it was because they could not contemplate the degree to which Americans, in their view, allowed this disorder and strife. It was beyond their imagination that the United States, with all its power, could not preserve order and stability.
You go to war with the army you have, not the army you might want or wish to have at a later time.
Indeed, the POTUS and the SecDef did not see eye to eye about the ultimate goal for Iraq. For the president, having removed Saddam, you couldn't just walk away. You owed Iraqis a chance to build their country. For George W. Bush, this wasn't simply a decapitation exercise. At the Pentagon, there was no such sense.
The important fact to keep in mind, and I think it is a fact, is that Donald Rumsfeld and President Bush were on totally different pages with regard to what to do in post-war Iraq. Rumsfeld wanted to disengage as quickly as possible. And President Bush, having decided to invade Iraq, did want to promote democracy and freedom. There's no indication that those were significant priorities at all of Rumsfeld or of General Tommy Franks, the head of the Central Command. So there was dysfunctionality at the very highest levels of the administration.
Those disagreements, in hindsight, foreshadowed more profound disagreements about America and its role in Iraq. And those disagreements would shape not only the U.S. military posture, but the diplomatic and military choices made by the Bush administration in the run-up to the surge of 2006-2007.